Good afternoon, everyone. We'll get started. My name is John Connolly. I am the director of the Institute, Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our panel on Ukraine with three distinguished Berkeley experts on the subject. I'm just going to introduce them very briefly and then turn the panel over to the panelists. So first, today will be Professor Steve Fish of our Political Science Department. He received his bachelor's degree at Cornell, got an MA at Johns Hopkins, and then a PhD at Stanford. He's the author of many articles and books. I'll just mention two of his books. First was Democracy from Scratch, Opposition and Regime in the New Russian Revolution. That was 1996. And then more recently, Democracy Derailed in Russia, The Failure of Open Politics, that came out in 2005. Steve will be followed by Professor Yuriy Gorodnichenko, who is professor, the Quantedge presidential professor in our economics department. Professor Gorodnichenko received his bachelor's in economics as valedictorian at the National University Kiev Mohyla in 1999, and then he went on and got a master's degree at the same institution. He was also the valedictorian, moved on to the US and entered the PhD program at the University of Michigan, where he received his degree in 2007. He's published dozens and dozens of articles on many things. His specialty is monetary economics. He also published a number of books before he got to the US in Ukrainian. For example, Contemporary Econometric Methods in Finance came out in Kiev in 2002. And there's numerous other publications that I could mention. His interests go obviously also far beyond economics, and we'll be hearing more about that today. And then last is Professor Ned Walker. He's an emeritus professor in political science at UC Berkeley, received his bachelor's degree at Harvard. Also, I believe a master's at Johns Hopkins, if I'm not mistaken, and PhD at Columbia University. And has published an important book on the breakup of the Soviet Union called Dissolution, Sovereignty, and the Breakup of the Soviet Union. And Ned was our director of the Berkeley Stanford program in Soviet and post-Soviet studies for many years, and we're pleased to have him back. So with no further ado, I will turn the floor over to Professor Steve Fish.
Thanks so much, John. It's such a pleasure to meet with this group today with old friends. I'd just like to make a few points here. First of all, what we see going on right now is far bigger than Ukraine, and it's far bigger than Russia. This is not a conflict, as many have said, over control of Central Eastern Europe. This is not a conflict over whether Ukraine's going to join NATO or not. This is a conflict, this kind of showdown between the forces of democracy and liberalism and of rights and those who represent the opposite, those who represent autocracy, criminalized rule, and world order, that essentially 19th century world order where might makes right, and powers can simply gobble up smaller neighbors because they can. This clarification, this kind of moral clarification that's going on right now is really remarkable. When you think about it, even during the Cold War, there was some room for moral ambiguity. The Soviet Union and China, under Soviet-style rule, at least pretended to represent regimes that would bring about much lower levels of socioeconomic inequality, regimes that would liberate women. They had a progressive edge. And even though a lot of that was nonsense, there was a little something to it. And people on the left all over the world could look to them for inspiration. What's more, the United States did some things, of course, during the Cold War that were truly awful. Vietnam War, for example. Sometimes the Soviet Union was on the right side of international conflict. You think about attitudes toward or approaches to the apartheid regime in South Africa. The Reagan administration was on the wrong side. We kind of coddled the apartheid regime's custodians in South Africa, while the Soviet Union was foursquare behind Nelson Mandela and the ANC. Those days are over with. What's happened now is that the great regimes of revolution and of progress, at least in their own terms, in the 20th century, being China and Russia, the Sovietized regimes, have now moved to the right. They flipped from far left to far right. What they stand for now is so-called traditional values. What they stand for is, let's just take a couple instances from Russia recently. Passing laws that stoke hatred against LGBT people. Passing, I don't know if you know about the so-called law on slaps that was passed recently in Russia, which decriminalizes domestic violence, which gives men one free blow before the charge that they must suffer is anything other than a petty misdemeanor charge. This is what's going on in these lands. Regression in every respect that we would consider it all to be moral regression. On the other side, you have countries that actually are now shorn of their colonial holdings. When we think about Western Europe, the United States is not engaged in any more moral absurdities such as the Iraq War. You have countries for the most part whose leaders are democracies. You have Democrats in countries that are not democracies, all lining up on one side behind Ukraine. And you can see actually in the UN vote today, the General Assembly vote, who did Putin get? Who actually voted along with Putin? Eritrea? I think along with for this invasion, a handful of other Venezuela didn't even show up to vote. Nicaragua, Cuba, some of these countries that are foursquare behind Russia they abstained from the vote. And we see the rest of the world, except for, of course, China, which I assume abstained. I didn't see the way China voted on the other side. So what's remarkable here is this moral clarification is of absolutely crucial importance for waging this battle against Trumpism, Putinism, Shiism, Maduroism, Bolivarianism, and so on, is that it's not a West versus East thing. It's certainly not an America versus Russia thing, but rather a conflict between those who seek a rule-governed world, a world in which leaders lose elections and leave office thereafter, a world in which women can actually become powerful and aspire to powerful positions, versus a world where none of those things are true. And I think it's incumbent upon liberals now to own that and grab onto it. I was not impressed with President Biden's speech last night. He did not draw this as the conflict between, for lack of better terms, good and evil that it has become. In fact, Biden has become the helmsman of the good guys. He really is de facto, and he's done a magnificent job in many ways of uniting the Western alliance, of giving Putin absolutely no concessions, and of guiding this effort, which so far has been very successful as Russian forces have faltered and the world has abandoned Putin. It would behoove Democrats in the United States, small d and large d, to tie this conflict as it should be tied, and it is in fact tied to what's going on at home. You have Putin's ultimate sycophants. You have Donald Trump and Tucker Carlson, who are out there shilling for an invasion, backing away just a little bit now, but who've been shilling for an invasion for months now. Now, for Democrats to tie them to Putin definitively, for Democrats, for people of the both left and right and center in Hungary who are now banding together to try to defeat Prime Minister Orban and his Fidesz party in their coming elections, for them to band together and to tie Orban to Putin. It's not that hard to do. He's been a Trojan horse prime minister for Putin for years right now. Now he's even backpedaling and saying, oh no, we're members of the EU, we're against this too. But I'd be very interested to know what liberals in Hungary or conservatives in Hungary are going to do with this. It seems like they should be able to leverage it for political gain at home. The world needs to see also that sacrifice will be needed. In President Biden's speech last night, his State of the Union address, he said, this probably isn't going to cost you much at the pump. We're going to release these 60 million barrels of oil from our strategic reserve, and hopefully that'll keep oil prices down. That's not the way to approach this. We need John Kennedy right now. We need FDR. We need somebody who can go before the people and say, we have a grand Lincoln-sized task that's being handed to us by fate or history or God. And it's worth a few cents at the pump to pay for this. We are going to have to sacrifice if we impose the maximum sanctions, which we're going to have to do. And he should be preparing the world for sacrifice and portraying himself as the leader of the, for lack of a better term now, perhaps it's more relevant than ever, free world than he's been. I also think it's interesting that Putin is so miscalculated here. The idea of going in with 150,000 troops and subduing and occupying indefinitely and annexing a country of 40 million people, many of whom, including ordinary civilians, are under arms right now. A country that's got a military that could easily, even if the Russian forces run over them, can easily melt back into society, into cities, and sabotage Russian operations for the indefinite future. This was a mad idea on Putin's part. It was a case of Putin simply losing it. We also see signs of him losing it in his talk of historic Russia in recent months. Historic Russia includes Finland. It includes, depends on the year or decade you look at, but it includes half of Poland, including Krakow and Warsaw. It includes, of course, all of Ukraine, the Baltic states, Central Asia, and so on. Now, what does that kind of talk do to Russia's relations with Kazakhstan? Not to mention Ukraine, but the Baltic states, with Finland, who looks like is probably now going to join NATO. This is absolute madness, and its effects were utterly predictable. We could have known this. We could have known that the Russian economy would collapse, and it is collapsing right now after an invasion like this. What this shows is that Putin has lost his touch. A lot of people are now saying Putin is going to result to massive carpet cities, going to be destroyed before anything gets better. That's possible. That's a grim possibility that is there. But I think we need to hold out hope for the possibility that long before he gets very far into a campaign to decimate Ukrainian cities, that there are going to be plenty of officers and plenty of ordinary soldiers who are going to say no. They've been told they're there to defend Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic. Russian citizens are not even being informed by state TV that they're attacking Kiev. Putin's lies and unreality are catching up with him. His troops don't know where they're going or what they're going for. They think they're going in for an exercise. Similarly, he's not prepared the Russians for war at all. Once Russians start realizing what's going on, that Kiev is being bombed. Everybody's got friends in Kiev and Russia. Everybody admires and loves the city of Kiev. That we're bombing that city to denazify a country with a Jewish president and where there's no swastikas around. The soldiers were told they're there to denazify Ukraine. They don't see any swastikas. They see a Jewish president, a prime minister. They see a people under arms sabotaging them at every stage. What this adds up to is, I expect in coming days, I don't just mean months and years, I mean coming days and weeks, the defection of some members of his military, of soldiers on the ground, certainly of his oligarchs who are losing money hand over fist, some government officials and military brass who knew this was a fool's errand to begin with. They've got the maps. They could see what Putin was ordering them to do. I don't think we can assume that Putin's forces will remain united. And when they start to fragment, Putin is toast. The question is whether Putinism is toast. That depends on us. That depends on Western powers and indeed the whole world of democracies and democrats and non-democratic countries holding together, imposing the maximum sanctions, being perfectly willing to sanction Chinese companies that are trying to help Russia break sanctions. If we're willing to do that, if we're willing to bear down and tie this conflict to the much larger moral conflict that I've been talking about, Putinism could be on the ropes as well. So let me reflect. How much more time do I have, Zach? How am I doing on time? Okay, I guess Zach can't hear me.
Maybe gradually wrap up. I think a couple minutes.
Okay, all right. Long and short of it is, we stand at a historical crossroads. This last week we started entering that phase. This is much more historically consequential than 1989. We probably haven't seen any global showdown between the forces of, again, I hate to say it, but good and evil like this since World War II. And even in World War II, you had Stalin on our side. So it wasn't even as morally clear then. But the fight against the Nazis was absolutely morally clear. The fight against the apartheid regime in South Africa was also completely morally clear, right? I mean, whose side are you on? Nelson Mandela or in the ANC or the apartheid regime? If we asked ourselves, what would Think of your favorite historical figures, your favorite moral figures, MLK, Mother Teresa, Jesus Christ, for goodness sake. Which side would they be on? Which side would they endorse right now? It's obvious. We have on one side the forces of autocracy, denial of rights and human dignity, a bunch of police state brutalists against imperfect and flawed Democrats. We also see coming to the fore in Europe a new generation. This crisis is forcing to the front a new generation of very young leaders, many of them young women, new leaders, new faces. President Kallas of Estonia, Prime Minister Kallas of Estonia, Prime Minister Šimaitė of Lithuania, Annalena Baerbock, the Foreign Minister of Germany. A lot of new faces in the battle for European security and the battle for peace and for democracy around the world. I see that as a very good thing. There's an emergence of a whole new kind of European consensus just over the last couple of weeks on Europe's need to take care of its own security. If Europe becomes a kind of co-security great power along with the United States, closely tied to the United States, but an entity that is actually paying its own way, building its own military forces, this could multiply the power, the political and military power of global democracies. For Germany's Chancellor Scholz to announce that he's going to increase Germany's defense spending from 1.5% of GDP to 2.1% of GDP next year, that's $100 billion a year commitment from a guy whose main issue is climate change. He's a lefty peacenik and Ostpolitik kind of guy. His whole coalition is made of people like that. His foreign ministers from the Green Party. For these people, and she's really been magnificent, Foreign Minister Baerbock in this whole thing, in standing up to Putin and helping to unite the West. You know, this whole generation of European leaders that's coming up now realizes they have to take care of themselves. They can't take peaceful, prosperous Europe for granted anymore. If Putin wins in Ukraine, Europe will become a house of war for the indefinite future. They don't want that. They are now willing to exclude Russia from the SWIFT system of payments, for example, which does cost them a lot. They're willing, I think, ultimately, if they're willing to really try to live with gas rationing for the short term and with a longer term strategy that will wean them off of imports of Russian oil and gas, then I really do think that, you know, the Putin's regime is in great immediate trouble. What's more, the Russian economy really is collapsing. Putin is under pressure that he never expected to be under. He expected, of course, the West to be soft. He expected Americans and Europeans would be willing to accept no sacrifices for this cause. He thought we've grown too cynical. He thought that the West and the democratic world in general had grown too selfish and soft and was too lacking in patriotism to rise up and smack him down like we're doing right now. Now we're actually showing that he erred in that, whether we're going to go all the way and really showing that we're going to stand up and we're going to dominate him, which is what we badly need to do if we're going to win this battle, rather than just acting defensively against his attacks. If we now seek to and succeed in dominating Putin, Putinism itself globally could be on the ropes. I'll end there.
Thank you. You're on.
Thank you. Every time I participate in these events, there is something in Ukraine, and it's usually very bad. And this meeting, unfortunately, is not an exception. Russia started an aggressive war against Ukraine. The war was unprovoked. But we should also understand this is not a random act of aggression. It's a part of a very long pattern we have seen over the years. Putin invaded Georgia, annexed Crimea, bombed Syria. And many of these sins went unpunished. And so he felt that he can continue his expansions in what he claims to be his sphere of influence. And I agree with Stephen that this is not just about Ukraine. In fact, it's not really about Ukraine when you take a big look at what is happening in Ukraine. I also agree with Steve that the closest analogy you may have about what is happening in Ukraine is what was happening in Europe in 1938-39. Hitler was taking country after country, and the democratic world was not interested in confronting him. It ended in a total and utter disaster, total massacre. Millions and millions of people perished. I don't know if I can talk about counterfactual histories here, but one can imagine a scenario where the United Kingdom, France, Poland stood united and stopped Hitler from annexing parts of Czechoslovakia, taking over Czechoslovakia, doing some type of Anschluss in Austria. I think it's our chance to test this theory really and try something different. We don't need to have to go through another major war in Europe and more globally, because if what Putin is doing now in Ukraine is unpunished, it's very clear that everybody is fighting for his or her safety by himself or herself, and no country is really safe. If Ukraine fails, how do we know that Latvia, Lithuania, Finland, Taiwan, or any other country that territory that is disputed now with major powers in the world is safe? Is it clear that the US is going to defend a small city in Estonia when there is or if there is a Russian invasion? I think it's a real test, and it's a test of all of us. And I'm really hoping that the United Nations, which was created to protect peace in this new global order, is going to up to the task, because otherwise it will go in infamy like the League of Nations that stood helplessly observing how the world is descending in World War II and not doing really anything. So the stakes are really, really high, and I hope our leaders are up to the task. They can rise to the occasion. And I agree with Steve that Joe Biden had an opportunity to declare himself a leader of the free world, become the next John Kennedy or Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He didn't use this opportunity, but I hope he will try to find another occasion to declare this role, to take this role. Thank you.
Ned, you're muted, Ned.
I'm back. So first, I would just want to thank John, Jeff, and Zach for inviting me back. I miss my old friends back at Berkeley. I wish these meetings didn't have to take place virtually. I'd get an excuse to come back, but maybe next time. I should also say that I agree with both Steve and Yuriy about the stakes that are involved in this conflict. That I think they're enormous, and how all of this plays out is going to have an enormous impact on history, on geopolitics for a very long period of time. So in my talk today, I was going to focus a little bit more closely on the actual conflict itself. I was going to start with just a few words of my take on Putin, then say a few words about how I see Russian military objectives, and then turn to Russian political objectives, or Putin's endgame, if you will. And then, if I have time, say something about prospects for an eventual settlement, possible political settlement. Okay, so Putin, I don't think that it's very helpful to, somehow wrestle with the question of whether he's sane or rational. He clearly doesn't rise to the standard of, insanity that would be required for an insanity defense in a court of law in this country. And rationality is a real rabbit hole. I mean, the Unabomber was rational in the sense that, he was able to build pretty good bombs and kill the people he wanted. But I do think, we can talk about his personality and also his emotional state. And there are, a lot of things we can say with confidence, things that we've been able to say for a long time, but I think things that have become clearer as well. So he's clearly ruthless. but he's also ever more isolated and angry and resentful and autocratic in his ruling style. And I think that what makes him most angry is his conviction that Russia has been treated badly and disrespected by the West. And I think he's also the kind of guy that, doesn't back down in a conflict and who brings, a knife fight, a shotgun to a knife fight. But at the same time, it's also clear, as Steve alluded to earlier, that he's not this clear-headed, carefully calculating foreign policy realist, who weighs costs and benefits effectively. Personally, I think he's made a great many sort of strategic mistakes when you think of Russia's objective international and security interests over the years. And I think this is, a complete disaster. I think he's in, an extreme informational bubble. He's been, in power for over 20 years, which is way too long. One thing I think is pretty clear is that he has, I think, a mistaken confidence in the efficacy of the use of military force. And I think he's about to learn a lesson in that regard in a very extreme way. So that's it on Putin. Just then on Russia's military objectives and a few general points. First, we do not know how this war is going to turn out. There's the inevitable fog of war problem, and we're not really sure about what's going on the ground now. We know a lot, and one knows a lot more than used to be possible because of all the open source intelligence and satellite imagery and all the other stuff that's available on the web virtually in real time. But still, there's fog of war. And even if we knew what was going on the ground now, we wouldn't really have any confidence about how the war unfolds because there's inevitably uncertainty in wars of this scale. Militaries adapt and war objectives change as the tide of battle changes. So that said, there are a few other, general observations that, can be made, which is that, it's absolutely clear that Russia's military performance so far has been much, much worse than expected. And the other side of the coin, and this was not unexpected to me, is that the Ukrainian defense has been extremely effective and indeed ferocious. They're helped by 7 years of combat experience in eastern Ukraine. They've received a lot of Western training, and now, and they've been getting Western military equipment for a long time, and increasingly sophisticated and effective military equipment, and that's all increasing now. It's clear they have very high morale in the regular military and in these territorial defense forces that are forming. They have many people who have had combat experience in eastern Ukraine who are now out of uniform, who are coming back into the fight. And they have a ton of public support, and not just support, but actual civilian participation in the war effort in many different ways. So just turning specifically then to the question of military objectives, I see 4 possibilities at this point. The first one is to encircle Ukrainian cities and forces that are east of the Dnieper, as well as Kiev, which is the west of it, the western part of the Dnieper predominantly, and squeeze them in the hopes of forcing concessions from the Ukrainian government. So a kind of more extreme version of what Russia did to Georgia in 2008. So the objective would be to punish Ukraine, degrade its military capabilities and defense infrastructure, force some political concessions, and then get out and then repeat as necessary. So that's one possibility. A second possibility, and I think this is really the most likely one, is not to squeeze, but to enter and occupy Kiev and other major cities, notably Kharkiv in the east, and keep most forces east of the Dnieper. A third possibility is to open up another axis of attack along the corridor west of the Dnieper along the Black Sea, all the way to Moldova, which would mean taking Odessa, another big city of 1 million people, and another very hard nut to crack. And then the fourth possibility is massing additional troops in Western Belarus and striking south in an effort to interdict supply lines from the West, which would in effect mean bringing the ground war and the general war to all of Ukraine, and presumably with Lviv in the crosshairs. So as I said, I think my take is that we don't know, where the Russian military is going to go for sure. But my guess at this point is that objective one is very unlikely, because I think it would take months to effect. Encircling and squeezing these cities and basically besieging them is not going to produce a result for many, many months. And remember, Leningrad held out for 900 days and never fell ultimately. Also, I doubt any Ukrainian government would capitulate or would survive if it did capitulate. And if they did, I'm pretty sure that Ukrainian units would just keep fighting on. That said, I also do think that there is a growing risk that those Ukrainian forces in the east that have been fighting in the Donbass line of contact are at risk of being surrounded and cut off. And if they are, we may see a prolonged effort by Russia to basically just grind them down. And that too is not going to be easy. And if it happens at all, is going to take a very long time. Just consider how long the battle for the Donetsk airport was. So in my view, most likely is objective 2, which means basically as above, but also to try to enter and occupy Kiev, as well as other cities in eastern Ukraine like Kharkiv and Mariupol, possibly Zaporozhye and Dnipro on the Dnieper River. But option 3 is also a possibility, that is to take the entire area or to, strike out another establish another access east of Kherson towards Odessa and all the way to Moldova. I doubt they'll do that. I don't think they'll do that because already what they're doing is so extremely ambitious, and I believe they're starting to realize that they've bitten off more than they can chew, and it would be extraordinarily stupid to make it even more ambitious, but they might. They've already done a lot of very stupid things in my view. And then that's same for option 4. I mean, one thing I will say about option 4, which is like trying to take Western Ukraine, is that will greatly increase the risk of some kind of clash with NATO. But I don't think that's likely, but it's possible. All right, so let me just say a few words about Russia's political objectives as I see them. There's sort of an institutional dimension to this, as well as a territorial one. So kind of what regime does Putin want to establish and where? So as far as institutional models go, I can imagine 3 possibilities. The first is a Finlandization model for Ukraine, which would leave Ukraine with considerable political autonomy domestically, a democratically elected government, very constrained, but at the same time very constrained foreign and security policy, with basically Russia presumably withdrawing its troops, but then threatening to reinvade if they violated the terms of that Finlandization model. A second option is basically a Soviet East European satellite country model from the Cold War. So no democracy, very limited autonomy, and Russian coercive organs, so military, intelligence, secret police, remaining on Ukrainian territory to police the new regime. And then finally, there's the model of full integration into the Russian Federation. So, my take is that model 1, Finlandization, is not nearly enough for Putin, that model 3 is probably too much and also creates more problems and doesn't solve some of Putin's problems, like having a buffer between Russia and NATO. So I think that that's quite unlikely. I think most likely is model 2, so the Soviet East European model, and the idea being to bring this, puppet state basically into some kind of union state arrangement with Russia and Belarus, of course, with Russia as the hegemon, just as the Soviet Union was the hegemon in Eastern Europe during the Cold War. So that's the sort of regime, aspect. There's also the territorial one. So where would this regime go? And again, I see three possibilities. I mean, doubtless there are more, but three main possibilities. And all of which at this point is pretty clear. They imagine Kiev being, the capital of. So the first is Kiev plus everything east of the Dnieper. The second is as above, but including that zone in the south from Kherson all the way to Moldova. And then the final one is the entire country. And again, for reasons I kind of outlined before, I think the most likely objective is Kiev plus east of the Dnieper, which will mean sort of a partitioned Ukraine, rather like East Germany during the Second World War, and perhaps an independent Ukraine in the West with Lviv at its capital, and then a kind of new, not necessarily an Iron Curtain, but a line of military contact between Russia and its allies, along that east-west border, partitioning Ukraine along the Dnieper. All right, so I say I'm running out of time. I'm going to skip the more cheerful and less plausible part of the talk, which was, prospects for political settlement. And I'm just going to conclude with sort of six concluding points. The first is that I don't think this war is going to be over soon. I think it's going to last a long time, months and months, maybe years. I think Russian efforts to take Kiev, Kharkiv, and other cities are going to be horrible. I think Ukrainians are going to keep on fighting, even if Kiev falls. I think the West is going to try to keep providing military assistance to the Ukrainian military and resistance forces. I think those weapons are going to become increasingly effective and lethal. I think the risks that this war escalates into an armed conflict between NATO and Russia are not insignificant. I don't think it's probable, but I think it's not unlikely. I mean, let's say maybe 25% chance that it happens, which is way too high when you consider the circumstances. And then I will leave you with one final happy thought, which is that I think if Putin is confronted with the prospect of a major defeat of his conventional forces, either at the hands of the Ukrainians or NATO, especially NATO, but even Ukraine, I'm pretty sure he will use whatever weapons are at his disposal, including tactical nuclear weapons, with the implication being I'm prepared to walk up the ladder of escalation as far as it takes to preclude the possibility that my guys are going to be wiped out. So it would start with one tactical nuclear weapon directed at one particular battlefield, and then potentially escalate. So with that happy thought.
Yes, thanks very much. Well, I won't comment. Thank you very much to all of you. We do have a few questions that have come in, and I would urge those in the audience who would like to pose questions, please do so now in the Q&A section of your screen. Type in your questions and we will forward them to our speakers. So the first question we have, which I will read, and you've touched upon this a little bit already, but perhaps we could have a fuller answer. Do you think it's likely that Russia will attack staging areas in Poland or other countries from where weapons are being shipped into Ukraine? If Russia does attack, what are likely results? And there was a story, I think, in the New York Times today also sort of going a little bit in this direction. Any thoughts distinguished panelists?
I would argue this is a very highly unlikely scenario. Trying to strike inside Poland or any other country which is neighboring with Ukraine and serves as a staging point would be suicidal for Putin. And, you know, as one of my friends observed, the fact that he is sitting at a very long table when he meets people tells you that he doesn't want to die, right? He is afraid of COVID or whatever. This is not the type of person who will say, I'll burn and everybody will burn with me. So there is certain rationale to his madness. As Ed said, you know, Una Bomber also had some rationality, but I don't think he is entirely mad to do such a thing. So number one. And number two, remember when the world was very close to a situation where mutually assured destruction was about to happen, there was a Soviet officer who did not push on the button to send the rockets. I think there is some degree of separation between Putin and nuclear weapons, and somebody in the middle will probably stop. So I'll say stop here.
I agree with Yuri. I actually think that, well, first of all, if you're talking about attacks in Polish territory, that brings NATO into it. NATO is then treaty bound to treat that attack as an attack on its own members. That means nuclear escalation. That means willingness to use nuclear weapons against Russia on the part of the United States. That brings NATO forces into it. I can't see him staging attacks outside of Ukraine. I just want to get on board with what Yuri said. I don't think that there's an awful lot of soldiers, an awful lot of commanders, including commanders of the strategic rocket forces, who are simply not going to be willing to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. I mean, if you do that, you lose whatever portion of the Russian people are still supporting Putin. It becomes much harder for China at that point to bankroll Putin's invasion. They're already skittish about this. I don't think they knew what Putin was going to do when they kind of declared this undying alliance with Putin. During the early portion of the Olympics. I think that what little support Putin has from abroad would evaporate. I think that he could expect the maximum sanctions, which would be simply a cutoff of his energy supplies. It's incomprehensible to me that I think it's very unlikely that Putin would use nuclear weapons at all in this circumstance. I think he would lose what little he's got left. His days would be numbered. This is not something most Russians want. It's certainly not something most of his military people would want. Obviously not something his oligarchs would want. This would subject, a large portion of the Russian elite to the kind of crimes that land you in the International Court of Justice, that land you in The Hague. And I just can't see them going that far. I also agree with Yuri's proposition that Putin is not someone who's willing to give his life for this. And that would become a danger if he starts using nuclear weapons. The danger then that we would take him out personally, if we could, I think escalates inappropriately, escalates to a very high level. I don't think he's willing to take that risk.
Well, let me just say, I don't think Russia would try to attack, Poland to interdict supplies coming in from the Western, any of the other NATO countries on on Ukraine's western borders. I do think they may try to, if in the event they try to invade Western Ukraine, I suspect the main purpose will be to interdict Western supplies coming in from the West. And if that were to happen, you would get NATO forces and Russian forces in reasonably close proximity. I mean, that has been true in many circumstances in the past, in Syria and so forth. So I don't think that is likely to set things off. When I was saying, set off a confrontation between Russia and NATO, but who knows? There's just a ton of uncertainty going forward. When I said the use of nuclear forces, first of all, I don't think it's very likely that Russia is going to face a conventional force crisis in Ukraine, but it might. And you have to remember that Russia has tons of battlefield nuclear weapons. I mean, thousands. And so I'm not saying that he would push the button and blow up the world. What I'm saying is that he would fire a missile at a particular target that would be primarily, a military target to reverse the tide of battle, but also at the same time be sending this message saying, hey, you're messing with the wrong guy. I mean, we've underestimated Putin over and over again. And I mean, that would be terrible because it would, violate the nuclear threshold that hasn't been violated since 1945, and presumably let Pandora out of the box. But the stakes are incredibly high, and I think that's one of them.
We have a number of questions dealing with the internal situation in Russia, which I'll summarize. First, how much support do you think Putin has in Russia? That's one. Second, what role does domestic opposition in Russia play in Putin's decision-making? How loyal do you believe Putin's inner circle are to him? And then there's a longer set of thoughts about factions in the Russian political cosmos, including Putinism, military dictatorship, great Russian nationalism. These are factions and constituencies in their own right that are not always happy with Putin or Putinism. There are also non-Russian ethnic polities, regional polities, pro-Western liberals, etc. So there are diverse and large forces that could tear Russia apart, in the words of this questioner. To what degree should we be afraid of the Russian state disintegration, which after all has an enormous stockpile of nuclear weapons, out of which something even worse or more dangerous than Putinism could emerge? So those are some questions about the internal constitution of Russia and a potential opposition at the moment. Any thoughts?
Steve should answer that.
Sure. I mean, I'm in terms of public opinion, we don't know for sure. I heard Jill Dougherty, for whom I have the greatest respect, I think it was 2 nights ago on CNN, say that she still thinks that Russians are buying Putin's overall narrative about NATO being at fault for this. And perhaps even most Russians supporting the operation. The thing is, they don't know what the operation is. They just don't know. I mean, if you're somebody who just watches Russian state TV, you don't even know Kiev's under attack. You don't know. All Putin, all these people are hearing is 24/7, is that there's a battle over Donetsk and Luhansk. Now, when Russians start actually finding out, of course, younger Russians in particular who rely on Telegram channels, social media to get their news, are actually finding out at least the other side of the story, which is the truth about what's going on. I've also spoken with Russian friends who are good, reliable nationalists, some of them fairly pro-Putin, who say NATO's to blame for having come to this impasse, but we're against the war. We're against the war. And I think if when Putin starts escalating to massive bombing of cities, massive civilian casualties, I think that a lot of his public, at least if they find out about it, are going to abandon him. On this issue of the loyalty of his inner circle, Putin has to worry about that right now. Members of his inner circle stand to lose and have already lost a great deal from this. When Putin starts looking weak at all, and he's going to start looking weak, he already looks weak, we have to remember this inner circle are loyalists, but they're also people who want Putin's pile. There's no loyalty or honor among thieves. Putin's pile and Putin's power is something that many of them would be glad to step in and take if the opportunity arose. When Putin starts looking weak, when he's on the ropes, when he's destroying the Russian economy, when he's destroying the Russian military, when he's destroying Russia's reputation abroad, and when he's destroying their ability and right to go spend half their lives in their Swiss castles and in London high-rise apartments, that's something that could turn them against him. And when he starts bombing Ukraine in a big way, look, I just don't think he's going to get the leader pocket or support that he needs. On the effect on Putinism, again, it depends on how the world outside of Ukraine plays this. Ukrainians will play the role that they have to. It's obvious now. They're never going to give up. They're never going to give up. Putin can't take over this country and occupy it. He can roll some tanks and sue me and say that, well, we took the city, and then what? Okay, so they've taken that. 150,000 troops can't do the job, so this is bound to fail. If the West plays this right, and if we're able to tie Putin and his wannabes together and portray them as this kind of army of regressive evil, I think actually Putinism is in trouble as well, as I remarked a little bit in my opening remarks. Afraid of Russia disintegrating, this Russian state disintegrating? I don't think so. I don't see that as a short-term danger at all. I think things would have to get so crazy in Russia for that to happen, that I don't think it'll happen. People don't want it. The security forces don't want it. Putin doesn't want it. I just don't see that as a big danger right now.
Let me add one thing to what.
Let me add this. Ned, I'm sorry to interrupt. Let me add this. Putin, there's no doubt, and this addresses Ned's point about use of nuclear weapons. Putin will be happy to simply depopulate Ukraine completely if he could have the territory. But I just don't think that his commanders and his oligarchs and his government officials and the Russian people are going to allow him to even begin that project. Okay, that's so.
Ned, just add one thing to what Steve said. I agree with most of it. But what I have seen, in addition to not necessarily very representative surveys, but in addition to indications that so far Russians support the war, which is not surprising, as Steve said, because of the amount of information that they're getting or the lack of information, but also because there tends to be this sort of patriotic surge at the beginning of military operations like this. But one of the other things I've seen is that Russians are extremely concerned about their economic situation, which was not great to begin with. And these sanctions have been extraordinary, and they're going to have a massive impact on the real economy in Russia. And public opinion can turn quickly, and we have been seeing demonstrations in cities in Russia, and those things can spiral basically. So I would say we don't really know. We certainly don't know how long the support will last, but there's definitely a risk to this regime from this incredibly reckless thing they've done.
We have actually a few questions related to economic sanctions, which I'll read. What do you think the economic outcome of this conflict is going to be with the current sanctions being enacted against Russia, but also with the war effort itself? Is there a possibility of economic depression similar to what was seen after previous wars? And then how likely are current sanctions to cause top Russian leaders to defect? And if it is unlikely, what exactly is tying the Russian leadership to Putin? Anyone?
If I may start, I would reiterate what Steve said in the beginning, that we pay a small cost now, maybe elevated energy prices for some time. And it's painful, it's inconvenient, but we should understand that this inconvenience, this pain, is going to be followed by a long-term gain. Think about the situation after the end of the Cold War. We saved trillions of dollars by not spending on military budgets. We were able to use those resources to invest in schools, in infrastructure, in healthcare. Using money for military purposes is not necessarily a good use of money. And paying a little more at the gas pump, it's costly, but it's not the end of the world. In terms of Russian economy and sanctions, I would say this. When I grew up as a boy in Ukraine, it was still a part of the Soviet Union. I never saw a dollar bill in my life. I never had foreign currency. I didn't know it existed. The world is much more integrated now. Russia depends on the West as much as West depends on Russia. If energy revenues severed, Putin doesn't have resources to pay for this war. We know that the financial system of any country is the bloodline, right? If it stops, the whole economy is going to go down. And it was unthinkable that big Russian banks, state-owned banks, are going to be disconnected from SWIFT. It's an international system to make cross-border payments. It was done. It was inconceivable that there will be any kind of sanction on energy exports from Russia. It is totally on the table now. And we know this has been done before. It was done with Iran, it was done with Iraq, Iraq could sell oil, but buy only food, just to make sure that people don't die from hunger in Iraq. It's not inconceivable that something like this will happen. And we know from history when in 1986 oil prices collapsed, when the Soviet Union couldn't get resources from the West, it was a big economic factor behind the demise of the Soviet Union. It just didn't have resources to support the economy. And the Soviet Union was much more protected from these external shocks. Russia is much more vulnerable, so we shouldn't underestimate the significance of the sanctions. One thing I would say is that there is a lot of talk about how unprecedented the sanctions are. But I would say, economic systems are highly complicated, and it is very important to make sure that the sanctions are not porous. We don't have loopholes. So if you disconnect SWIFT from Russian banks from SWIFT, you shouldn't just have a set of banks. You should disconnect everybody. The Russian government is going to try to find workarounds around this sanctions. It's important to make sure that they stay in place. And as one of the speakers mentioned today, if China is trying to help Russia to bypass these sanctions, there should be enough courage to enforce the sanctions even on Chinese banks to make sure that sanctions are actually working. They inflict significant pain on the Russian government to make sure that this Western financial system or technology does not fund war in Ukraine.
So there's a, thank you. There's a question that is identified with Ned, but I think actually all of you could potentially respond to it if you like. This conflict seems a perfect mirror to the two dominant theories of international relations: liberal internationalism, which insists on the universal validity of Western values, and realism, which urges the accommodation of competing security interests. Do you see a Kissingerian solution as desirable, or do you think the West should continue to insist on Ukraine's future membership of a Western economic or even military union? I think I know what Steve would say to that, actually. But it's what do you think, Ned?
Well, my line on that was is, that there can be unrealistic realists, and there can be unrealistic liberal internationalists. And I'm normatively a liberal internationalist, but I try very hard to be realistic. And so, having a realistic and sort of, steely-eyed take on your adversary and not suffering from, preference bias or confirmation bias or any of the other, many biases that affect people, particularly when they're thinking in sort of normative terms. I'm generally sympathetic to people that are like that, but as a sort of school of thought, realism, this is a very complicated subject, but realism has its failures for sure. And in some ways is also kind of an ideology, and you can be very bad realist in applying, you can get it just as wrong.
Yeah, I think this whole conflict actually is showing the poverty of Kissingerian realism. There are variants of realism I buy into, and certainly, the realists, if one can attribute to the realists a kind of hardcore anti-naivete approach to problems, then sure, I'm a realist too. But in broader strokes, I really think that, honestly, I'm so glad that Kissingerian realists are not in charge right now. And I think their whole approach to the world is being discredited. If this were a battle, if we're in a realist world, Russia would have already taken Ukraine, or at least it'll take Ukraine once it gets its act together militarily, because what the Ukrainian people want and what they think doesn't really matter. It's state against state, it's force against force. Realism has very little room for ideal interests, for ideology, for political passion on the ground. It completely misses out on Putin's biggest problem, which is the 40 million Ukrainians don't want him there, are going to do anything they can to keep him out. This is not a battle of state against state, military against military. This is a battle of an entire mobilized people, and indeed the world, driven by liberal principles, supporting Ukraine. That's what's underpinning this whole thing. And what's emerging is a world of united, or relatively united, liberal powers who actually do believe in the international global order. It's not an American global order anymore. The United States got the ball rolling after World War II, but this is a world order that even China, to a large extent, actually participates in. Thank goodness Kissinger is not in charge right now. Russia would already be in control of Ukraine. We would have followed Tucker Carlson's advice, and China would have already taken over Taiwan, and then we deal with them as great powers. That's not the world the United States wants to live in. Not with criminal regimes in charge in Russia and China, to be sure. So thank goodness liberalism is not, we don't have, we don't have so-called realists in charge right now. And realists should be very, very, I think they've got egg on their face at this point too. A realist also would not have predicted that Putin would move as recklessly and irrationally as he has. It would assume a certain kind of rationality, at least at the level of military planning. It would assume that one man's deluded vision and ridiculous impatience to get on with this absurdly impossible imperial venture would be checked by people around him who would assess national interests, military capabilities, and the Ukrainian resistance capabilities in a rational way. They would give that to the leader, and the leader would act accordingly. What we see here is a complete scrambling of the so-called realist logic, which I often view as very, very naive in and of itself. And thank goodness.
So we have a few questions. Yuri, did you want to?
So just, one quick point. I totally agree with Ned and Steve. And, I was astounded by the moral bankruptcy of realpolitik in this conflict. How can you defend Nord Stream for so many years? It's going to be the stain on the German governments, for years to come. You can't, Olaf Scholz, how can he continue being, a leader when, he was supporting Nord Stream for until the very last moment? It's so crazy. And it was also remarkable that moral leadership came from Ukraine, from the president who was not, cut out to be, many people thought, to be a leader of the free world. It was just, striking how tables were changed. We have a saying in Ukraine that the comedians turn out to be statesmen, and statements turn out to be comics in the Ukrainian tragedy.
Very good. There's some questions about diplomacy and its role before and perhaps after, during and after the crisis. So first, pundits like John Mearsheimer are alleging that it's all the fault of the West. Had we made certain concessions to Putin, starting that we won't let Ukraine into NATO, et cetera, this would never have happened. I rather think, this is a former diplomat, by the way, I rather think that this was Putin's war of choice. What's your opinion? And second, are there any options now, that is this month, for diplomacy, and what might they look like? Who could broker them?
This was Putin's war of choice. Mearsheimer is one of those realists that has egg on his face. His whole argument has always been, I think, a little bit tenuous. On the other hand, I see his point. I can see from a realist point of view how NATO's expansion did, leave Russia, leave Putin in particular feeling aggrieved. But I'm very glad that expansion happened. Now, in light of what's happened here, was it his choice? It was Putin's choice. People around him, most of them, I don't think wanted this war. Certainly, I think many of them understood some of the basic truths that I've been trying to convey here, which is that you can't take over a country of 40 million people with 150,000 troops and with aerial bombings and just hold it indefinitely. Not when that country is under arms itself. This was Putin's choice. He wasn't driven into by NATO. Wasn't driven into it by anything other than his own imperial ambitions. We have to remember, though, here that for Putin, Ukraine is an existential thing. It being part of Russia is necessary for Russia to be what Putin sees it is. Putin cannot imagine Russia without Ukraine any more than most of us Americans could imagine or would accept the United States without New England and the Plain States. This is Putin believes this, and I think over the last few years he's believed it even more viscerally. He's been sitting alone in these rooms with maps and military history, and and just kind of marinating in his own imperial delusions. But let's face it, this is what Putin it was made for. This is what he wants to do. You know, the economy improved quite substantially during his early years in power, riding the, you know, the end of the shakeout of the Stalinist economy and skyrocketing oil prices. But since then, its performance has been lackluster at best. Putin doesn't have a great economic program that he's going to present to the nation. He can't afford to undertake a real developmental program like China did, because it would threaten the whole political basis of his regime. He can't do that. He doesn't have an economic program. Politically, you know, I mean, what's next for Putin? All this has been about, everything we've seen, including destruction of the domestic opposition, has been about this moment, this war that he's been dreaming about more than anything else. This is what he was made for in his own mind, and he'd see himself as a failure if he ended up leaving office without having secured at least the core countries of what he calls historical Russia, which would be Belarus, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan. He might leave the rest to his successors. But the point is for him, this is what it all comes down to. In terms of whether this diplomacy is possible, no. There's no room for diplomacy here at all. Putin has made it clear for months that that's not a possibility. And I can't see it happening. I do think these diplomatic, these meetings of Ukrainian and Russian officials to negotiate provide the Ukrainians with a very good opportunity to say F you to the Russians in a very clear way, and in a way that actually is rather humiliating for Russians. I don't think there's any room for diplomacy left anymore. Putin has foreclosed that completely.
I tend to agree about room for diplomacy, but that, so that's on the one hand. I mean, I would certainly say at the moment, the prospects of a ceasefire strike me as incredibly low for many reasons. In addition to, Putin's maximalist demands, just from a purely military standpoint, you have troops all over the place. They're not consolidated. There's sort of no consolidated lines of contact. It's hard to imagine that you could get a ceasefire under these circumstances, even if Putin and Zelensky agreed to them, which I think is extraordinarily unlikely for now. But I think it's also true that it's extraordinarily unlikely that Russia is going to succeed in this project. I don't say extraordinarily unlikely, but very unlikely. And its maximalist demands are not going to be realized. And they're going to realize that the Ukrainians are going to fight for, a very long time. And so that's on the one hand. On the other hand, it's also true that the Ukrainians are probably not going to be able to drive Russian forces out by military means alone, unless there's a complete collapse of, Russian military morale, and you begin to see troop defections and, the officers' defections and the general staff, basically mutinying. And which I think is possible, but, unlikely. So what that suggests is at some point, I mean, it's just hard to see how all of this plays out. But at some point, there's a possibility that there will be a kind of military situation that enables a political solution down the road. And, I would hope that people in the government would, basically be taking the position that whatever Zelensky agrees to, assuming it's Zelensky still, we'll support up to some limits. And then also, be willing to go along with things that he asks us to do. So in the event, for example, that he asks us to agree to a graduated lifting of sanctions, if any agreement is implemented, I would hope that our governments, Western governments, would signal we'll support what Zelensky wants, because it's going to be very important. I mean, it's hard for me to imagine this. I mean, I don't know how this war is going to end, to be honest, but it's hard for me to imagine any kind of political settlement that doesn't include some kind of face-saving exit ramp for Putin, unless Putin gets overthrown, which I certainly wouldn't count on. So at some point down the road, it's a possibility that we're going to get, a chance to see an actual political settlement that ends this war.
I would add to this. I would add to this that for many people in Ukraine, there is a growing sense that what happens now, this war, this is really a great patriotic war. You're not fighting for, kind of material sense. You're fighting for freedom. And under these conditions, it's very hard to settle on something which is not consistent with this objectives. That's number one. And number two, there is also a growing sense in Ukraine that Putin is like Hitler. It makes no sense to negotiate with him. Imagine you are Finland and Stalin in the 1930s. Stalin is about to invade Finland. Does it make sense to negotiate? Take into account quote unquote security concerns that somehow Finland threatens Russia? Makes no sense. It's the same story with Hitler. He had various security concerns. People were trying to satisfy these concerns, meet somewhere in the middle. It turned out to be a very bad decision. And so I think, people in Ukraine understand that I agree with Nat that now negotiations are hard to imagine. And as a result, this thing can go on for a long time.
Yeah, thank you. I think it is extraordinary that sort of there's this grassroots sense of moral clarity. So something Steve has mentioned this, that suddenly it's almost as though there's after a rain or even after a storm, suddenly there's a clarity that didn't exist before it. And it's interesting that it's the people, the sort of the average Ukrainians, who are seeing this maybe better than we are. And that on the note of Ukraine, I want to inform you all that there will be at Sproul Plaza tomorrow at noon. So Thursday, March 3rd, there will be a rally in support of Ukraine organized by the Russian Association and Friends. So please Google that if you're interested. Otherwise, just show up at noon at Sproul Plaza and look for people of similar sentiments. Here we have what might seem as a relatively optimistic question. So why don't we go to that? How do you think after the fall of Putinism or the illiberal regimes could be most effectively fought, and by what means? So it's sort of a practical question. Like what would be, I guess, if I could follow up on this, a series of measures that one would endorse in order to make sure that a Putinism doesn't reemerge in some other form elsewhere. And I guess we would include Orbanism, Kaczynskiism, right? Trumpism, perhaps. These seem to be allied phenomenon. Any thoughts from the?
Yes, liberals have to stick together. We have to portray this conflict as what it is. Biden and company in the United States. Here's where Putinism is most dangerous. Is you've got a former president and a leader of the Republican Party who worships the ground that Putin walks on. And the United States, thank goodness, is not led by Donald Trump right now, because things would be going very, very differently, in fact. So taking on Putinism at home, using this conflict to tether all the bad guys together and portray our side as morally right, is on the right side of history, as cool, is on the move. This is absolutely crucial to defeating Putinism. And I think we can begin this even before Putin goes down. And I do think Putin will be out of office much sooner than many of us think. So I think that's actually key. What's more, the Western alliance and its partners abroad. We have to include all democracies in this. President Tsai of Taiwan just announced today her salary is going to, she's donating her salary to helping the Ukrainian opposition. That kind of global alliance, we need to make sure Japan plays a big role in it as well. Australia, New Zealand, our other allies around the world, or countries that just happen to be democracies that aren't necessarily strong allies of ours, we need to recreate a sense of the free world. We don't use that term, perhaps it's been discredited, but not the Western world, not the West versus the East, but of a world that encompasses South Korea, Japan, any other country that has a democracy, and that encompasses democrats and autocracies like Alexei Navalny and his people. To the extent that we can do that, we can defeat Putinism.
Yeah, in the Cold War in West Berlin, there used to be an American radio station, and every night at 6 o'clock they would say, "Eine freie Stimme der freien Welt," a free voice of the free world. It always sounded great, I have to say. There's a question about experts. So, and you're experts, so perhaps you'll have thoughts on this question. One of the comments I've heard most is that the experts on Russia were entirely incorrect in not expecting Putin to launch a full-scale invasion. what do you think the blinders were, and how can we try to avoid future assumptions of this sort? Any thoughts?
Well, I mean, there are experts and experts. The people that I follow and admire.
Tell us some names, perhaps, for the audience.
Well, the guys who I was paying the most attention to, I began really paying attention again in November, when this military, it was actually the second military buildup. The first one was in April of last year. In November, it was clear that something was afoot, and I, started paying close attention to this, the military side of this. And there were two guys in particular who I follow carefully on Twitter, Michael Kaufman and Rob Lee, but there are a bunch of others as well. And if you looked at where the size of this buildup and where they were going, and the whole buildup in Belarus and so forth, it was, and also the consequences of it before the invasion took place. Like already it was leading to additional weapons coming into Ukraine and a strengthening of NATO's eastern defenses and all the kinds of things that Putin objects to. So it just struck me that this amount of the scale of this buildup made it extremely unlikely that he was just going to turn around and send all. He had forces coming all the way from the Far East and from the virtually all over Russia, the naval forces coming down from the from the north, and it was just an extraordinary military buildup. So that the people that I follow and I'd say admire most of the ones who were the most alarmed were the guys who were really watching that military buildup carefully, and they were basically saying the scale of this is so enormous it's hard to believe that they're not actually going to pull the trigger.
I don't understand is how anybody could watch Putin starting with his just telling us straightforward. He's been doing this for 10 years with the talk of the Russian world and so on. How anybody months ago could have actually looked at this, troop buildup aside, military buildup aside, and continue to believe that all Putin wants is his country's security, interests in Ukraine respected, and that he was comfortable with an independent Ukraine as long as it wasn't, a member of NATO. I honestly, I'm going to give an answer to the questioner that's going to be perhaps, here's my answer. It's liberal bias. I mean, by liberals, I don't just mean lefties. I mean progressives. I mean classical liberals. We don't want to believe the worst about people. We can have Donald Trump telling us, I'm going to dismantle democracy. And we say, well, no, it's like Joe Biden, it still treats Mitch McConnell as a friend. I don't know if you saw his remarks at this prayer breakfast a couple of weeks ago, where he thanks McConnell for being such a man of honor and his friend. We liberals don't want to believe anybody's that bad. Well, sometimes people are that bad, and they've been telling us all along what they want to do. And we're frankly hiding our heads in the sand like an ostrich. How anybody could actually believe that Putin would be satisfied with some sort of a negotiated settlement that would leave Ukraine, I think is partly a result of liberal bias. Also, there's a desire to not return to the militarism of the Cold War. There's this feeling that, especially after the Iraq War, that if the United States gets its kind of nationalist mojo back, that somehow we're going to be off to Iraq or some other new conquest. And so we need to seek diplomatic solutions with Putin and kind of take what he's saying seriously. There's a kind of tendency on the part of liberal academics, which is to say almost all academics, to regard the United States and its great power activities with suspicion, and look to anybody who stands up to the United States as a kind of counter-hegemonic force. Well, it turns out that Putin is actually, truly on the wrong side in all respects that we hold dear, that we liberals hold dear. So I think that Putin is disabusing us of our naivete, and I hope that it'll have the same effect on Biden and the Democratic Party's approach to the Republican Party and to Trump here.
Steve, are you? I think you froze.
Sure. Did I freeze? I'm not sure where I froze.
The last word.
Which part of my little?
No, it was just the very end, just the very end of the sentence.
Very end. All right.
We have
please.
Go ahead. Yuri, did you want to say something? Let me just move on. We have a couple of questions about the military. The Russian, I almost said Soviet, the Russian military. A website has been set up in Ukraine to post the identification of dead Russian soldiers because dead Russian soldiers are either abandoned or cremated, so there is no public knowledge. Do Russian mothers pose a threat to Putin when their sons do not return from Ukraine? And here's a different kind of question about the Russian military. What do you think about the actual state of the Russian army? It has been shown that the quality of their equipment is largely overestimated by Western forces.
John, I can tell a story to appreciate the significance of Russian mothers and so on. There was a guy, a Russian soldier captured in Ukraine. He's from Ulan-Ude. This is like really, really far east. And you know, he was captured, he was filmed, and his mother recognized him in these videos. And she believes that he was captured by armed forces of Ukraine, which is very different from the Nazi forces that roam in Ukraine. It's just total nonsense. There are no Nazi forces, as Steve said in the earlier remarks. We have the president who is a Jew. How can a Nazi country be run by a Jewish president? That's number one. Number two, this mother was trying to reach out to the unions of soldiers' mothers. These guys, this organization was telling her, look, you know, they in Donbass are doing reels. We have nothing to worry about. We're not going to respond to this. And so there is very clear situation that, you know, they are not there. We have seen this kind of stories before. The Russian forces were not in Crimea. They were not in Donbass. There is a denial about that. And if those people are killed in Ukraine, they were denazifying Ukraine, and so it's a honorable death. So it's okay. We're willing to take the sacrifices.
So one of the ways in which Ukrainian performance has really exceeded expectations, shall we say, is in the information space. And when you compare this to the Georgian war, the Ukrainians are just so much better prepared for waging war in this space and doing it very effectively, in my view, and cleverly. And one of the things that they're posting tons of stuff on the internet as well. So one of the things that they've done is set up or announced a program whereby captured Russian soldiers are allowed to call their mothers, and they film it, and then they put it on the web, and they try to distribute it, as widely as possible. So I mean, there's many areas of where the military guys who I follow on Twitter are perplexed by how badly Russia the Russian military is performing, but it goes into many different areas, above all logistics, but not only. And trying to explain that is difficult, but one of the reasons is just the battle plan seems to have been really, really poor. But one factor that I think most people think is very important is it appears that the Russian military brass, let alone the soldiers and the rank officers, field officers, did not actually expect the invasion to take place. So they went, and they were told that, especially the soldiers were told that, if they were going in, it was going to go into just to rescue people in the Donbass who were being killed by fascists. And so they really didn't expect to do what they did, and they did not expect to find the resistance that they did. So what they call their operational security has been terrible, and they're getting hammered in so many ways, but including by these drones. In part because
Even this, he doesn't even dare tell his own people what he's, these soldiers, including his soldiers, including some of his brass, they think they're going there for training exercise, and they're told, okay, now we're gonna start, shooting at that target. You don't know why they're there. It's all Putin's lies catching up with them, and I think this is actually absolutely crucial. I think capturing Ukraine, using captured Russian soldiers to convey the Ukrainian cause, let them make calls home. I think treating them very humanely is a great idea. I think that perhaps if you want to really take this a step further in terms of propaganda, release them. Let them go back to their hometowns in Russia. Let them go back to Russia. We're not talking about enough troops to regroup and make a big difference in terms of troop strength. Show them what a democracy does with those who've come and violated its borders. Let them go home. This would be incredibly humiliating to Putin, incredibly humiliating to him, and incredibly humiliating to his whole regime. Also, what's being conveyed here is that if you do that, is Ukrainians are saying, this is not a battle among nations. This is not Ukraine versus Russia. This is those of us who want to live in a Europe that's not a land of war, but rather a land of peace. Those of us who actually believe in human rights and human dignity, acting the way we do. And here's the way Putin is treating his own soldiers. Here's the way we're treating Putin's soldiers. We don't regard them as enemies. I think this would have a really felicitous effect on dividing the Russian people from Putin. And I think that gap has already begun to grow. Let me just make one more remark here. When it comes to dealing with Russia and the Russians, I think we make a big mistake, and President Biden makes a big mistake when he refers to the Russians or Russia as our enemy. Russia will pay a high price, the Russians this, the Russians that. He should talk relentlessly about Putin, 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 Putin. This is not the Russian people's war. We don't want to turn it into a nation versus nation thing. He has to leave open a lot of space for Russian people to turn against Putin. When we're talking about the Russians and Russia rather than Putin, let's face it, this is more empirically accurate too, because this is Putin's war. Russians didn't want this war. I don't think most of his brass or most of his oligarchs certainly didn't want this war. I think we need to open that gap between Putin and the people he relies on, including the mothers who you referred to, who I do think can have enormous effect if their message is amplified. I think this is crucial to fighting Putin. What's more, I think it's important in the United States that we don't treat Russians as enemies. I really am a fan of Representative Gallego and Swalwell, who are two of the really gutsy Democrats who've been standing up to Trump during the Trump Russia, during the Mueller investigation in 2018. Gallego wasn't in office yet, but Swalwell was doing it. These guys now, though, and I really respect them in many ways, they have called for the expulsion of Russian students from American universities. I think this would be a very wrong-headed thing to do. Most of these people are not, my Russian students here are not children of Putin's top oligarchs. They're not children of the people on the sanctions list. They're ordinary Russians, many of them from middle-class families who got the opportunity to come to Berkeley. They're not necessarily pro-Putin. I don't think they're pro-war. And what was it John just read out? The demonstration in favor of Putin, against Putin, and in favor of defense of Ukraine tomorrow is being organized by, if I understand it right, the Russian Students Association on campus. We need to remember that we're not supposed to expel these people, rather support them in their effort to distance themselves from Putin. And if they don't, I think they should be allowed to stay here at any rate. I don't want this to become an anti-ethnic Russian campaign. I'm an inveterate Russophile, and it's as an inveterate Russophile that I so strongly oppose this invasion and despise Putin.
Yeah, there was a great video on my Twitter feed today showing a woman who survived the Leningrad siege. I don't know if you all saw this, carrying signs. So she must be maybe in her 90s, and being carted off a demonstration in Petersburg by riot police. This woman she was carrying actually two signs, written in her. She's very, very concerned about the war, and people were, of course, clapping for her, and then she was carted off. So I'm going to shift to a somewhat different topic. We haven't touched upon foreign relations to the east of Russia. So we have a couple questions about China. How would different outcomes of the war affect China's strategy vis-a-vis Taiwan? It's one question. And the other, what role is China playing? What does it support in words? And who does it support in action? Or are they staying neutral? Any thoughts?
Let me take the Taiwan question. My sense is that this, what's happening to the difficulty that Russia is having invading a country that it shares a border with a huge preponderance of power, at least seemingly, as well as the extent of the economic sanctions on Russia, I think are going to make China rather less likely to proceed eventually with some assault on Taiwan. I mean, Taiwan is not quite as big as Ukraine, but it has a very large and sophisticated military, and it's also an island. And to see how difficult it's been for Russia to do what it's doing in Ukraine, and the consequences, I think it's going to, I hope it's going to make the Chinese leadership rather more cautious about Taiwan. And the other factor is that hopefully there'll be a lot of lessons that the Taiwanese will learn about sort of, flexible defense.
I would say there are certain parallels. Russia always claimed that the Crimean Peninsula is a deeply, deeply Russian territory. And so this flare-ups between Ukraine and Russia about who Crimea belongs to, they've been going on for many, many years. China never recognized that Taiwan is outside China. It's Chinese territory. And I'm sure that the Chinese are watching very, very carefully what is happening in Ukraine. And again, I said this before, if Ukraine falls and if Ukraine doesn't get enough help, how do we know that Taiwan will be protected by anybody? And then China will feel differently. Hopefully we'll not get there, but it's a possible scenario.
Look, I think Xi Jinping clearly intends on invading and annexing Taiwan, and probably much sooner than many of us would hope is the case. And I think I don't think we should be naive liberals here. I think that's his goal. He's announced it, I don't know how many times. The pact that Russia where Russia basically said you can have Ukraine, and Russia said we recognize no legitimate basis for any form of independence or sovereignty on the part of Taiwan. That was kind of the little blood pact that they can go back to the 19th century and take over whatever territories that they can take over. I think Xi Jinping is going to be heartened by a victory of Putin in Ukraine if he starts rolling out victories, if he's able to withstand the sanctions. I think the invasion of Taiwan will be hastened, and I see it's coming very soon in the next couple of years for sure. I think if Putin has his nose bloodied, if we discover what trying to occupy a country of people who don't want you there actually looks like, there's no doubt the size for China, of course, is much larger. But the United States also has far, far deeper interest in Taiwan than it does in Ukraine. And I think this will put Xi back on his heels, the leader of China back on his heels, and slow down his plans, and then basically throw cold water on his plans to invade and annex Taiwan, which I do think is high on his list of priorities.
So, gentlemen, we have just a couple of questions left, so and about 10 minutes to respond. So I would appreciate succinct answers to these. Maybe we can get them in. So there are two questions related to NATO in different ways, but I'll read them both. At what point might NATO forces become directly involved in the Ukrainian conflict? I think you've touched upon this already, but perhaps one of you would want to take that up again. And secondly, theoretically speaking, nuclear deterrence works only if both sides are making rational choices. But could Putin still be considered a rational decision maker at this point? If Russia deploys nuclear weapons on Ukraine, would NATO be deterred from launching a nuclear war with the former? Any thoughts?
Well, I should say I don't think a conflict with NATO is very likely, but it's worth worrying about unlikely and catastrophic events, and worth, thinking about how to manage supporting Ukraine without starting World War III. Then the other thing that, to go back to this rationality question, from Putin's perspective, you always have to try to put yourself in the mind of the other person. As I said, I don't think it would be irrational for him if he felt like, his forces, his conventional forces, were on the verge of a catastrophic loss, to use a battlefield nuclear weapon. I mean, people think, battlefield nuclear weapon means, all of Ukraine will go up. Oh, that's not true. That it would be catastrophic for many reasons, but it would, in all likelihood, I mean, I don't know what would happen, but all likelihood would not mean that we would just keep walking up the ladder of that escalation to a full-blown strategic exchange between the United States and Russia. There's tons of thresholds and tons of exit ramps long before you get all the way up there. So, I mean, I don't think we're getting a confrontation between Russia and NATO. I don't think Putin will use nuclear weapons, but unlikely things that are extremely high consequence are worth worrying about.
We have a question about.
Can I address that one real quickly?
Okay.
I think NATO will face a confrontation, a nuclear showdown with Russia, if Putin succeeds in Ukraine. There's no doubt that if he succeeds here, he's going to, keep working on his big dream, which is destroying the Western alliance. And he knows that if he makes a step into Estonian or Latvian territory, Lithuanian territory, and the United States does not respond with full force, including threats of at least the use of nuclear weapons, that the whole credibility of the Western alliance is gone. And I expect him to absolutely press it to that level if he succeeds in Ukraine. If he doesn't, he probably will be much less likely to do this. In other words, the way to avoid nuclear confrontation with Russia is to beat him in Ukraine.
I have a question about
irrationality. I really do think that the use of battlefield, let me finish this, John, the use of battlefield nukes would be a psychological barrier that would change everything.
I'm sorry, Steve. It seemed like you're just. I guess I'm going out. You're going out. So I'm sorry for interrupting.
No problem.
We have a question about the demonstrators in Russia. Are the citizens of Russia facing consequences for demonstrating against Putin's decisions? What do we know about that? Any insights?
Absolutely. They're getting arrested. I don't know. I think there are 3,000 people or something have been arrested in the last week. And there are people being arrested for really minor infractions, like hanging, no to war signs out of their apartment buildings. So, there's no doubt that it takes a measure of bravery to come out onto the streets now in Russia and oppose what's going on.
It does, but the numbers are going to proliferate. And keep in mind, these demonstrators, all they have to do is say no to war. They're not saying no to Putin, even for that matter. They're not. This isn't a demonstration where they're out challenging his power. They're just saying no to war. That's pretty easy for ordinary people to say of all political orientations. And it's really hard for Putin in moral terms to keep arresting and perhaps ill-treating people who are just saying they don't want this war. Most Russians don't want this war.
Okay. We have some questions, more questions about Putin, and I think that could wrap things up. Do you foresee a future in which Putin remains president of Russia and the West rolls back sanctions? That's one question. And the other is there any realistic expectation that Kremlin insiders could or would act to remove Putin? What do we know about these?
Well, regarding sanctions, I would say Ukraine was independent for many, many years, but it had to operate under sanctions imposed on the Soviet Union after the Afghanistan invasion. So the sanctions are going to stay here for a very long time. I think it's also a wake-up call for many policymakers in the West that Russia is not a trustworthy partner. You should minimize dependence on Russia in every possible way. There is zero incentive to deepen trade ties, technology ties. Just recently, MIT Massachusetts Institute of Technology canceled its joint program with Skolkovo. It's a Russian place in Russia where they wanted to emulate the success of Silicon Valley. And if it happens at this level, it's hard to imagine there's any reversal of this policies in the short run. It'll take many, many years.
It's interesting because in the Cold War, we used to think that it was a good thing to have economic relations with East Bloc countries because that would lessen the likelihood of some kind of conflict. But it seems in this case that any kind of relation, certainly economics, seems to strengthen Putin's hand, and therefore, at least for the foreseeable future, we'll be stepping back from that. There is finally a question about the border dispute between Poland and Belarus. If you'll all recall, in 2021, thousands of refugees from other continents were used as pawns to provoke Poland into reinforcing the eastern border. Was this a prelude to the current conflict, a deliberate attempt to cut Ukraine off from Poland, or a smokescreen to move troops to Belarus? I don't know if that's, any thoughts on that?
I have no idea. I think that was basically just Lukashenko, perhaps with the cooperation of the Kremlin, or at least the clapping of Kremlin hands, to make life more difficult for Western countries and for his Polish neighbor. He was very mad about what had happened with the Belarusian uprising, and he was like, he was lashing back.
Okay, there is actually one more question came up regarding Poland, since we're sort of tending westward. Is it possible, and I think I know where the question is going, to at the same time combat Putinism and Kaczynski at this moment? That is, there's an odd way that Poland is sort of in the front line of this struggle, but it's in the hands of a populist, right populist government. Any thoughts on this? This would require some insight into Polish politics. Do you guys have any sense of this?
Yeah, I don't think, the problem is you got bad guys signing up with the good guys here for reasons that have to do with nationalism. And I think we have to welcome the bad guys, the Kaczynski and the Peace Party, into the club as long as they're on the right side with this thing. I don't think this is the time to go after Kaczynski. Will it change the dynamics of Polish politics? Maybe less than would change the dynamics of maybe less than, say, Hungarian politics, because the right-wing populists are at least sticking up for freedom and democracy and standing up to Russia. So I think this becomes a case that's actually that's ambiguous, and I think that we ought to welcome the Poles, whoever the leaders are, into the club for now.
Yeah, there seems to be some reconciliation across the camps in Poland currently, as far as I could tell, at least in this matter. Okay, well, we're just about going to ring the campanile here in Central Berkeley campus, so I think we can move to a conclusion. I want to thank you all and the organizers, but especially the three of you, for taking time to share your thoughts with our audience. Give you a virtual round of applause and invite our listeners to do so as well. Perhaps we can come together and under more favorable circumstances, but you've also been very sober about the likelihood of what will happen in the next couple of weeks. So in any case, we'll keep ourselves informed, but you've helped us tremendously. So I will adjourn our meeting and urge you to keep an eye on our website for further events which will bear upon this crisis.
And John, this is going to be posted, won't it, on YouTube?
Yes, it's been recorded.
Good.
So
terrific.
For those who couldn't be there today. So good night from Berkeley. The campanile is just beginning.
Thank you.
Good night.